Your life.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gemma Iolfi from the Basel Institute on Governance, and I'm honored to welcome you to this Anti-Corruption and Integrity Forum panel discussion on enhancing trust in infrastructure investment. Ambassador Todd Robinson, who will be giving his opening remarks in a moment, is the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs at the US Department of State. We have an illustrious panel whom I will introduce in a moment, but for now, let's kick off without further ado. The floor is yours, Ambassador. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gemma, for that kind introduction. And thank you to our colleagues at the OECD for organizing this event. As we all know well, corruption erodes democratic governance and promotes instability. In many cases, it enables criminals to flourish financially and subvert the political process. In some instances, in fact, it can become so entwined with the political structures that it is hard to tell when corruption ends and legitimate governance begins. Today's events demonstrate that all too well. It is well documented that Putin and the Kremlin run a kleptocratic regime enabled by corrupt oligarchs. As we are sadly witnessing in Russia's unjust and unprovoked war with Ukraine right now, these dynamics, when unchecked, can have dire real-world consequences. Further, all over the world, transnational corruption tilts the economic playing field against hardworking citizens and makes it harder for them to provide for their families. It wastes public resources and undermines the rule of law, making governments less effective and less trusted. The bureau I lead at the State Department, INL, has capacity building programs in 90 countries around the world, utilizing over $1 billion a year in foreign assistance funds. The deleterious impact of corruption threatens all of INL's work, whether countering narcotics trafficking, strengthening the administration of criminal justice, or stemming money laundering, and illicit finance. Corruption undermines the ability of law enforcement institutions to deliver accountability and the faith citizens have in the system's ability to deliver justice. But fair and effective criminal justice institutions are just one facet of sound public administration and one form of public good. And the same kinds of concerns are present when it comes to an issue such as corruption in infrastructure, our subject today. The delivery of infrastructure that provides essential services and enhances well-being in a manner that is fair and transparent is a core function of democratic states. However, infrastructure development is all too often undermined by special interests that may, through corruption, fraud, or collusion, deflect infrastructure investment from its intended purposes. This diverts scarce resources to private ends, generates environmental degradation and health and safety risks, and generally causes harm to citizen well-being. This has a real human cost. I saw it in Guatemala, for example, where I had the honor to serve as ambassador. The Chimaltenango Highway project was plagued by corruption during the Morales administration, was poorly executed, and resulted in dangerous flooding and landslides. While officials lined their pockets with public funds that should have gone towards ensuring the road was constructed safely. In Brazil, Odebrecht, one of South America's largest construction companies, paid more than $780 million in bribes to government officials across Latin America and the Caribbean to win contracts for public infrastructure projects in a scheme the Department of Justice has described as massive and unparalleled. In projects where Odebrecht paid bribes, costs increased by 71% on average, compared with 6% for projects with no bribes. Not only did the costs of the projects go up, but the bribes paid directly undermined the democratic process. The money paid in bribes was used mainly to support political campaigns and give the company undue advantages in future public biddings and contracts. These are just two examples of why it is more important than ever that infrastructure projects are implemented with measures that promote the interests of the ultimate beneficiaries. The Biden administration believes a post-COVID world that is inclusive, open, resilient, and sustainable requires public trust and integrity into the economic system. Nowhere is that more necessary and challenging than in infrastructure development where complex supply chains, large sums of money, and elevated socio-political expectations can be drivers of corruption and conflict. That is why President Biden and the G7 partners agreed to launch the bold new global infrastructure initiative, Build Back Better World, or B3W. B3W is a values-driven, high-standard, and transparent infrastructure partnership led by major democracies to help narrow the $40+ trillion infrastructure need in the developing world, which has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 epidemic. Through B3W, we are committed to providing citizens of recipient communities with the long-term benefits they expect and deserve from infrastructure projects. Our efforts will be guided by high standards and principles relating to the environment and climate, labor and social safeguards, transparency, and anti-corruption, among others. How do we get there? The Blue Dot Network initiative, led by my colleagues in the State Department Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, together with Australia, Japan, and with technical support from the OECD, supports the goals of B3W. The Blue Dot Network is a multi-stakeholder initiative. That means it brings together governments, the private sector, and civil society to encourage adoption of trusted standards for quality, global infrastructure development in an open and inclusive framework. Countries that implement the Blue Dot Network certified projects can attract greater investment by building investor confidence in the quality of the project. Certified projects will embody transparency and openness, mitigating certain financing risks. Blue Dot Network certification will also reassure local communities that infrastructure projects comply with environmental and social safeguards and are aligned with climate goals. Importantly, Blue Dot Network certification will also demonstrate that infrastructure projects meet international standards for anti-corruption. To help the projects meet these standards, my bureau, INL, launched a project last October in partnership with the OECD to develop an infrastructure anti-corruption toolkit initiative. Through this project, we are developing a toolkit to help stakeholders in infrastructure projects, including those in government, private sector, and civil society, to better comply with anti-corruption standards. The toolkit will include a guidebook on anti-corruption standards for infrastructure projects and trainings for state-owned enterprises, small and medium-sized enterprises, government representatives, and civil society. We will also help the capacity of organizations to comply with anti-corruption standards through public-private dialogues and secondments of compliance experts who will help build and strengthen anti-corruption compliance programs in state-owned enterprises. By helping stakeholders in infrastructure projects better meet anti-corruption and other standards, we are better able to level the playing field and reduce risk for businesses that want to operate transparently and with accountability. We are also able to make it much more likely that infrastructure projects deliver for the people they are intended to benefit. The United States is not just increasing our focus on corruption in infrastructure. This past December, the White House released the first ever U.S. strategy to counter corruption. Its 5 pillars lay out a comprehensive approach to how the United States will work domestically and internationally with governmental and non-governmental partners to prevent, limit, and respond to corruption and related crimes. The strategy places a particular emphasis on better understanding and responding to the threat's transnational dimensions and positions the private sector as a key partner. With the OECD as our host today, I would be remiss if I did not applaud and support efforts made by the members of the OECD Working Group on bribery to strengthen and support the implementation of the Anti-Bribery Convention, including the forward-looking measures the group adopted to prevent, detect, and prosecute foreign bribery. We all know the societal ills brought about by corruption, and it is time to redouble our efforts to tackle it. As President Biden has emphasized, we must start with diplomacy rooted in America's most cherished democratic values: defending freedom, championing opportunity, upholding universal rights, respecting the rule of law, and treating every person with dignity. Combating corruption is a key part of this commitment, and it is central to our foreign policy. We are excited about our continued collaboration with the OECD on this important project and remain ready to contribute our expertise and assistance. Thank you again for having me, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and to participating in this discussion.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I was particularly struck by the way that you reminded us of the devastating effects of corruption on democracy and the rule of law. The numbers that you gave us, 71% cost increases in the Odebrecht, the money being siphoned off for undermining democracy, essentially. There is much at stake here. So thank you very much for outlining the seriousness of what we're talking about, but also highlighting some of the ways that this can be tackled in a constructive way. So thank you for those, and we will come back to you in the course of the discussion. But for now, we would like to turn to Her Excellency Patricia de Lille, Minister for Public Works and Infrastructure of South Africa, who will be making her welcome remarks by way of a video link, as she is busy in Parliament today and couldn't join us live. Thank you very much.
Good day, and thank you for the invitation to join this very important panel discussion on a matter that's very passionate to me. My greetings to all of you, and my apologies that I cannot be live with you tonight. Infrastructure, investment and delivery is vital to the growth of any economy, and it's catalytic for development too. As South Africa, we understand the importance of infrastructure development and investment to crowd in the investment by the private sector to grow our economy and create the much needed jobs. But while corruption stifles growth and development, its most devastating effect is that corruption steals from the poor. Corruption also causes a trust deficit between government and the private sector, and we must work harder to regain that confidence. And we have established in South Africa an anti-corruption forum that consists of all the law enforcement agencies, the private sector, civil society, and also the Council for the Built Environment. The state has structures in place in government, but government cannot do this alone. And we must bring in the private sector and other civil society bodies to help us to fight corruption. We cannot allow the thieves to continue to steal from the poor and to steal billions from infrastructure. Our forum is an integral part in our ammunition of measures to mitigate against corruption as we implement our infrastructure plan. We need all hands on board to root out corruption and assist with the reconstruction and recovery of our economies after the devastating blow of COVID-19. The objectives of our forum is also to foster collaboration and to monitor the implementation of infrastructure. So the South African Forum has got oversight over investigations, and we see various agencies working together to enhance accountability. So our Special Investigating Unit already had massive successes in recovering some stolen money through the Special Investigating Tribunal. The forum also ensures that investigations are expedited and reports are submitted on a quarterly basis to foster accountability. We also need to protect and incentivize whistleblowers in our countries, so that we spend more money in rewarding the whistleblowers rather than spend money on investigations to find out how the money was stolen. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your panel discussion, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Minister, for your welcoming remarks. I'd now like to spend just a moment briefly introducing the other panel members who will be joining with the Ambassador. First of all, Delia Ferreira Rubio, who is the Chair of Transparency International. Warm welcome to you, Delia. Kenneth Blanco, who is Chief Compliance Officer, the Financial Crimes Unit at Citi. Justin Ross, who is the Chief Compliance Officer at FedEx. And last but by no means least, Gavin Heyman, Executive Director, Open Contracting Partnership. As I said, the Ambassador is also joining this panel. So a very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking the time today. So let's start, if I may, with you, Delia, and to expand the discussion and the scope of the topics a little bit further. Last week, Transparency International, together with about 130 other organizations, issued an open letter to the EU institutions and the member states on the urgent need for beneficial ownership transparency. Why is this so important, and how can it help with infrastructure investment? Perhaps you can help us understand the links here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hema, for the question, and the OECD for organizing the panel. Of course, we have seen in the last month that having information about the beneficial owners, the real beneficial owners, is central, for instance, to apply the sanction and implement the sanctions that the community has decided in view of the war in Ukraine. And beneficial ownership transparency is an essential piece in the integrity system, particularly when we talk about infrastructure projects, which involve huge amounts of money. Beneficial ownership registers, and we have been asking for this for many years together with other organizations, allow access to information about who is really behind the mask, who is really behind the strong aims. And if we have this information available, usable in an open way, we can detect and prevent conflicts of interest and undue influence. From the point of view of governments, they can be more effective in fighting against money laundering and tax evasion. Of course, we need to have this in a form of public, central, publicly accessible information, which is verified and audited. We cannot have or keep on having registers with information that is not verified or is not publicly accessible. That's the importance in general of beneficial ownership transparency. And in the case of infrastructure projects, this is a key element that is considered also part of the Blue Dot initiative standards that we have to use to guarantee infrastructure is run with investment in a trust atmosphere. So let's go together for this. And we are in the right moment now. Now, the Financial Action Task Force has just modified the 24 principle on beneficial ownership transparency. We have initiatives in the US and Canada and many European countries. So this is the time, and it is a very useful tool to guarantee transparency, integrity, and accountability.
Thank you so much, Delia. I think you're right that this is something that is the right time to be doing this. And I think if it was ever doubted, then the effectiveness of sanctions is certainly showing its merits in a very profound way at the moment. So thank you for putting the arguments to all of us. Let's broaden the parameters beyond the very important topic of beneficial ownership with a question, if I may, to you, Kenneth. As a former federal prosecutor and regulator, and now in your current role at Citi, you have a broad perspective on the role played by financial institutions as gatekeepers to financial markets. Do you think that the financial sector could have done more and should have done it sooner? When we look at these sanctions, the money laundering risks that arose during the pandemic, as well as the urgent need for more investment into infrastructure. It's a difficult question, but I hope you can help us get our heads around the complexities of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you for having me. Let me start off with the disclaimer. And obviously, although I am the global head of financial crimes at Citi, I'm here representing myself, and what I say is what comes from me and not necessarily Citi. But let me just say this. It's always easy to look back and say, could things have been different? I will say this, in my experience, both as a federal prosecutor and as a regulator, the financial industry does a lot more than what you see it doing. There is a lot of public-private partnership that goes on with a lot of institutions, a lot of governments, and a lot of private work as well. I think we always learn from our experiences. One thing about the financial sector is that it is diverse, it is dynamic, and it is ever-changing. And I think you see that right now in what's going on. I love Dalia what she was saying about beneficial ownership, where, as many of you know, here in the United States, there is the Corporate Transparency Act that was passed by Congress, and that is being looked at now. That is a critical element for not only financial institutions, but other businesses to take a look at what corruption is like. Can we do better? Yes. Should there be an avenue for the public and the private sector to work better in a way where the conversations can be more Chatham House rule-like? I think that would also be incredibly important. I think the Blue Dot idea is something akin to that, and that is where you're bringing in experts from the financial sector and the business sector to make sure that there are guardrails when we're talking about infrastructure contracts and we're talking about the association of government and business. And I think everybody knows, and everybody should recognize, anytime you have a lot of money and you have government involved, you're going to have a problem. And the transparency of that is critical. People don't necessarily see it as an infrastructure project. They oftentimes see it as, how am I going to put that money in my pocket? And I think it needs to really be approached in a way where we have to have our eyes wide open and not be very naive about it. But partnering with the financial sector, I think, is critical in getting that done. I hope I've answered your question, but past is prologue, right? We need to make sure that we take a look at the things that happened in the past so that we don't let them happen again in the future.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. Yes, hindsight is a wonderful thing, as we know. I was very curious, if I may just very quickly pick up on one of your points that you made, that having avenues to work together better in future, private and public sectors. When we look at infrastructure and the complexities and so on, do you think that this would be a particularly important way of, say, the financial institutions working together with the public sector, looking at infrastructure in particular, or were you talking more generally?
Oh, no, I think listen, the devil's always in the details, right? And what you'll find is corruption begins to morph. It's not static. Corruptors are going to be taking a look at the easiest way for them to make money. And once you begin shoring up one avenue, they're going to look for another one. And so you really need to be able to look ahead, not only what you're doing now. Right now, yeah, infrastructure, but there are other avenues for public figures and public corruptors to make money off the public. Many ways of doing that. We just have to be cognizant of it. One of the cash cows just happens to be infrastructure.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Let me turn to another frontline industry that has been confronted with morphing corruption, if I can borrow your phrase, Kenneth, logistics sector. Justin, there have been successive global disruptions that we've seen over recent times, and they have led to what has been called the supply chain crisis. We also know that, as everybody has said, that corruption thrives in circumstances of scarcity and where there's large amounts of money available. Perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about how the risks have impacted FedEx and how you're navigating this challenging environment, and perhaps give us some pointers on what you have learned from these experiences. Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. And look, I'll touch on something that Kenneth said about corruption. It is like whack-a-mole. I mean, the corrupt parties, well, and the pandemic was one of those situations where corrupt parties found ways, new and unique ways of corruption. So I'll talk about FedEx specifically. It's pretty well known. Look, during the pandemic, it brought on some serious capacity constraints in the transportation markets. So this was mainly caused by the commercial air carriers cutting international flights. So there's a lot of freight that's carried in the belly of these commercial carriers. So when these flights were cut back, there was a lot less capacity. And so these capacity constraints brought on by the pandemic enhanced some corruption risks out there. One, commercial bribery attempts by customers who were absolutely desperate for cargo space. And then you also had the enhanced risk of corrupt customs officials who were seeing opportunities to seek improper payments, to speed up the clearance processes, forego inspections, forego duties and taxes, all those type of things. So from a practical perspective, one thing we've done, and this is not necessarily groundbreaking from a compliance officer's perspective, but it's increasing awareness to our team members around the globe. Tell them these are enhanced risks, and here's what you do when you're faced with it. And giving, I think what helps is giving real world examples when you're doing this. Not only whether it's something external that's happening in the news to another company, or whether it's a real example that FedEx faced. And we think these real world examples really hit close to home for our team members, make them realize these aren't just theoretical exercises or theoretical or hypothetical situations, but this can and does and will really happen if you're not looking out for it. So awareness of the specific issues, I think, is key. And then another thing we've really stressed, especially on the international side, and I think Minister DeLille touched on this in her remarks, and that's the importance of speaking up whenever you see something wrong. And we've seen that the willingness of employees to speak up is impacted a lot by the country and the culture, frankly. So in some countries, employees are very willing to speak up. We see that in our experience, we see that in the US. While there's other countries that they're not as willing to speak up due to cultural or historical issues. So to address this, each year we do a very significant Speak Up campaign that focuses on the importance of speaking up, how to speak up, how managers can address concerns that are brought to their attention by team members, and then what happens if you don't speak up. And we've seen some great results from these Speak Up campaigns and seen some increases in speaking up where we have not seen that in the past. And then frankly, I'd be interested to see how the EU whistleblower directive impacts this going forward next year and the years to come. So I really don't think we should underestimate the importance of a speak up culture in preventing corruption, because I'm telling you that is absolutely table stakes for having a good compliance program.
Thank you so much, Justin. I don't think anybody here would disagree with you on that, but I think what you've also highlighted is very important, in that in the last challenging years that we've had, the role of compliance has become ever more important and has to become relevant and dynamic and adapt. I see Ambassador would like to come in. Would you like to come in right now?
Because I'll lose my train of thought if I don't do it now. I could not agree more actually with all three, Kenneth, Delia, and Justin, about the importance, and the minister from South Africa, about the importance of protecting and incentivizing people on the inside that see corruption happening. Today, right now, there are incredibly courageous anti-corruption fighters from Guatemala that have had to flee their country because of the role they played in fighting corruption years ago. And it's just a shame that there's not enough action on protecting those who do lift up their heads and speak out, because the incentive goes down when they see that the results of speaking up is exile or jail in your country.
I think that's a very important thing to remember, and how dangerous it can be in some places. And that's, we come back to the political will and the rule of law and democracy, how these things are so closely intertwined. I'd like to bring in Gavin into the conversation. So we've heard that the complexities of the development of compliance and corruption and so on, but infrastructure is also hugely complicated, as we know, and complex projects are vulnerable to corruption. So looking at the different stimulus packages that have been directed now at infrastructure development, what do you see as the critical measures to ensure that the past mistakes that we also all know about are not repeated? And which stakeholders need the most support to incentivize greater integrity in infrastructure? Thanks so much, Gavin, for your perspectives on these.
Wonderful. So as you said, these packages are going to be very large economically. They're going to be urgent. There's a real need there to kind of build back better from COVID and everything else. And just like I said, a bit like the octopus tentacles behind me, right? You have multiple different interactions. These are complicated projects, long supply chains, long time horizons, vast amount of silos and fragmentation across government. So all that's going to be a huge challenge for kind of misspending. And there's going to be a lot of corruption risks that need to be looked at and tracked. And you could even like bid for and win a contract fairly and then kind of corruptly renegotiate it and double the price later on. So that's all a challenge. I guess my approach is not just like to ask for a bit more transparency, to really push for a rethink or an upgrade in how we're going to plan to deliver infrastructure projects in future. I think there are three key things that can make a difference. So first of all, we need to improve the rules about how we plan and deliver projects. We want kind of reforms around that whole infrastructure like planning and delivery cycle that really center on the needs and benefits for citizens and how we sort of match what the actual urgent kind of developmental needs are actually with the spending. That doesn't happen anything like as much as we all assume it should be doing. So that feels really important. Have we got a single clear rule book that we are all agreeing to abide by? And if we haven't, we need one. So that's reform number one. Number two, then, is really a structured approach towards opening up all the information across the entire cycle of the kind of planning and delivery and procurement of these projects. And you want to both track the project level and also the contract level of information. And thirdly, super importantly, we need structures that promote collaboration across the key stakeholders, right? If we're going to genuinely make change here, we need to start, to work with communities and citizens, to engage them, to win their trust. And then we have to design for that right at the start if we want to get different outcomes. And I think we need to go at scale, because we're not just talking about one project, we're talking about 3 to 5% of the economy in some of these stimulus packages. So we really need to jump from like a paper-based approach to a data-based one. So I think it's a powerful role for things like open data standards, but with those three key reforms, I would love to see them being baked into the blue dot approach, so that with the project certified, you can be confident all three of these different dimensions of what we need have actually been included. I do think there are some great examples of better practice that are emerging. I think one really nice one is the Inter-American Development Bank's Mapa Inversiones investment map approach, because that's been shown, they've done some analysis that it's actually making a difference to planning and how intergovernmental and governmental and your local stakeholder consultation and systems and data gets exchanged, even in quite difficult environments. And they've actually done a kind of paper looking at kind of before and after and a randomized control trial, and the results are quite impressive. We're talking about kind of efficiency gains and better information of 15% or more. So that makes a big difference. We have to start with governance, right? So if we want all the stakeholders to work together, but it does require that bravery and the willingness to do things differently, to think open by design, by government at first. And I think that's super important. And so we have to really think about that. in the chat, I'm just going to pop a really nice example from the City of Mexico with their eco-bike scheme, where they really started with that open by design approach, had fundamentally better outcomes, kind of doubled the reach of the project, like for the same amount of money, and hugely upgraded the kind of infrastructure. And we're talking about 30,000 users taking thousands of journeys each day. So done right, this can make a huge difference. And then very last comment, let's also make sure we never forget the role of local civil society, just like the ambassador was saying so movingly. There's incredible, whistleblowers and champions of anti-corruption in really tough environments. How do they know that the international community has their back and that they're being supported? Quite often, civil society is the least funded, least engaged actor. There's not much resources there. If we want them to have agency and use information, we have to give them capacity, training, and resources. So just a special plea while we focus on governments, not forget about civil society and to power up like civic monitoring as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Gavin. That was a very intensive list of good ideas and so on. I think the 3 points, the planning and delivering projects through much more comprehensive stakeholder consultations, if I understood that correctly, linking up really with the needs of the communities rather than these white elephant projects that we've seen so often in the past, and the structured approach to the whole of the cycle at the project level and the contract level as well. And then again, involving communities, local civil society organizations and whistleblowers using a database-based approach. So consultation, avenues of reporting and speak up, becoming a bit of a recurrent topic here amongst the panelists. I don't know whether, Ambassador, you'd like to come in on this with the Biden-Harris administration and how they're engaging with the private sector as part of the US strategy to counter corruption and the Summit for Democracy. I don't know if this would be a good moment for you to say a few words about that, if you would like to.
Sure. I think the Biden-Harris administration has obviously taken to heart the idea that the private sector is really important it should be an important ally in the fight against corruption. As you probably know, INL is working with the OECD on this project to better engage the private sector in infrastructure projects. The Biden-Harris administration recently announced the new presidential initiative for democratic renewal. And a central part of this agenda is the global initiative to galvanize the private sector as partners in combating corruption. Through this initiative, we hope to expand our public-private dialogues to identify shared corruption challenges and contributions toward solutions. Identify, disseminate, and advocate for good practices for ethical businesses, and facilitate two-way information exchange between the private sector and governments. Obviously, this is not entirely new. The State Department engages with businesses on countering corruption in the context of the G20 anti-corruption work stream, through private sector involvement in the extractives industry transparency initiative. And as we participate in we also participate in the OECD working group on bribery. Just a few examples.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Maybe I'm going to shift back, if I may, to Kenneth and to hear about what City is actually doing. I know you're speaking in your personal capacity here, but obviously it's hard to escape the hat that you have on from Monday to Friday at least. So what is City doing?
No, every day.
Yes. I'm sure. I realized that I was saying that probably was cutting you too much free time. So what is City doing differently when it comes to supporting quality infrastructure, such as its role in the Blue Dot Network, Build Back Better World, and how does City really support multi-stakeholder approaches to integrity, given what we've heard from Gavin and also from Delia?
Yeah, let me just say, City, as you can tell, has a broad reach globally. It's got its footprint in so many different places. And I think that is an advantage for city in seeing what goes on. And to Justin's point earlier, the cultures and the laws and the norms are so different everywhere. And understanding those are really important in understanding what is going on and why things are done the way they're done. What city does is, quite normally we follow our rules, laws, and regulations, right? We look at who is owning these investments. We are looking at who is transacting through our rails. We are looking at and working with our counterpart banks and financial institutions. We are working with local governments and businesses. We are working with nonprofit organizations to make sure that we understand the projects that we're involved in and the people with whom we're dealing with. And that's really important. That's why we keep harping on the fact of, beneficial ownership, transparency, accuracy. I mean, when you're looking at transactions that have to go through 3, 4, 5, 6 different hoops, well, one has to wonder why that has to happen in a world of transactions where you can send a payment in an instant to one person. Why does it have to go through 3 or 4 or 5 different hoops? Well, there could be a legitimate reason for that. But our interest, and I think that we've done a great job here at Citi of bringing people together in our organization who have a passion not only about the laws, rules, and regulations, but the spirit behind them. Because it's easy to follow the laws, rules, and regulations, but understanding what brings about the consequence of not following them and the impact that it has on everyday people, getting that culture and making sure that our people understand that are really important. But like many other financial institutions, I don't think it's just Citi. We reach out to our local governments to do infrastructure projects locally. We make sure and that we have a way, because we are looked at by our regulators, of making sure that we understand who our customers are, what they're doing, and if there's a change in what they're doing, why is there a change? All of those are flags that indicate that there may be an issue or a problem. All these red flags. And we exchange red flags with other financial institutions and with our regulators. We try to predict what is happening in the future to our conversation earlier today, because it is whack-a-mole. When people want to make money, they're going to do some crazy things, and they're going to find ways to try and do it. And typically, they don't want to follow the rules. And we've got to make sure that we ensure that they do follow the rules. So Citi is very active in public-private. Citi is very active in forums. Citi is very active in explaining how the financial system works, not only to regulators, but to politicians and to legislators who end up making the laws, rules, and regulations. So we're very active and vocal, I think.
Thank you. And I don't underestimate that it is a 7-day-a-week job of trying to bring different silos together in a huge organization such as yours and many other financial institutions. Certainly bringing people together across silos, even where you have encouragement to do that, I know in reality and in practical in terms, it can be really challenging, really difficult. So it really is an endless task of reminding people and actually taking the time, as you say, to do that due diligence. And in the complex projects that we see in infrastructure and the importance of that, it can't be underestimated how important that investment of time really is. So looking at the complexity of the ecosystem, if I can call them that, of actors, investors, lenders, contractors, suppliers, engineers, Justin, based on your experience of managing supply chains through a pandemic and now in the difficult situation we have with the war in Ukraine, what lessons do you think we can learn from your experience in addressing corruption on infrastructure projects? We've heard some about breaking down silos now from Kenneth, but maybe you can add to the positive side of the balance, as it were.
Yeah, look, I think FedEx and frankly, other multinationals for that matter, are in unique positions to influence anti-corruption because of the breadth and scope of our operations around the world. I mean, we operate in 220 countries. We have 550,000 employees around the world. We interact with government officials around the world and work with hundreds of thousands of vendors. And every touch point that we have, we try to influence our partners to do business the right way. And that not only means refusing to participate in corruption if it comes up, but being intentional about helping our vendors or government official counterparts on anti-corruption. And one of the ways that we do this is on anti-corruption training. So we provide actual anti-corruption training to some of our larger vendors, employees. We continually stress to all of our partners the importance of anti-corruption through this training, through various communications and awareness campaigns. We also do anti-corruption audits on some of our larger vendors. And as part of any mitigation or action plans that come out of those audits, we often provide these vendors guidance on developing policies or internal controls that will help with anti-corruption. So look, we feel it's our responsibility to, I call it casting the shadow of doing business the right way. And anytime we can have a positive influence on any partner in this area, whether it's a vendor or a state-owned entity, we feel it will build and hopefully cascade into other areas. And to me, that ultimately influences infrastructure development as well, because some of these same partners are involved in other projects that are maybe unrelated to FedEx, but will impact or involve infrastructure. So kind of cascading that to our partners, we believe will have that positive impact. I'll take one more second to plug the OECD Compliance Without Borders program. I think this is an awesome initiative. It's where you have volunteers from companies like FedEx who advise and assist state-owned entities on building anti-corruption programs, advising on anti-corruption matters. And we think, we're really excited about it and willing and happy to partner with the OECD on this. And it's very similar to what we try to do. Partner with state-owned entities, partner with vendors to help them on anti-corruption. So at the end of the day, I think it's extremely important to try to use these various touch points, all of these touch points that we have around the world as opportunities to build this anti-corruption awareness.
Thank you so much, Justin. I don't want to leave out Gavin or Delia. So on this question of the role of the private sector in infrastructure investment and enhancing trust, I don't know, Gavin, in your experience of bringing together multi-stakeholders in this very specific area of open contracting partnerships and so on. We've heard from Kenneth, we've heard from Justin, and also from the ambassador about the role of and the importance of the private sector. What would you like to see that would help close some of the gaps here from the private sector? What do you think could be done?
I think one of the key things, exactly as Justin was saying, that proactive voice speaking up in favor of better practices. So, one of the things we see is like hugely debilitating, for example, is there's often this concern around we can't publish any information because it's all commercially confidential, right? It's all going to be locked and sealed in the contract and no one can access and use it, and it's a state secret or something. And so, in reality, business practices are changing. I can remember when I was first working on the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, 10 plus, 20 plus years ago, where publishing on mining contracts was seen as absolutely forbidden and almost like radioactive. But now you have over 20 plus governments publishing the information, and you have dozens of amongst the world's largest businesses that were actually actively encouraging that, particularly in the mining sector. So I think the kind of business practices can change over time, and I think business making a positive case. Actually, we benefit from this. We're investing in this infrastructure project for 20, 30 years, right? We're hoping for a stable cash flow. We want it to be kind of assetized and sold on to the international financial system. Therefore, we want it to succeed. We recognize the critical need to involve local stakeholders. And speaking up proactively about that, when Kenneth said we follow the law, great, but go beyond it to encourage best practices. Saying, we favor amazing contracts, right? And contracts that everyone has trust in and that are seen to be trusted. It's not just about just following the law, it's going that extra step to actually get the win for all the stakeholders. I think business can play an even more proactive role with that. And then just to kind of set people's minds about, we're not after everything being published all the time. There should be a proper process to look at that. But we think it's really important to think about how to share the information that people find most useful to them in the best format at the right point in time. So just to give you one last very quick example, we looked at all the common objections we heard from both business and from governments, and governments often very nervous about getting out ahead of businesses, particularly major international businesses who could be big foreign investors in the country. And we put them together into a myth-busting report of all the concerns we heard. And we just went through and said, what does the evidence actually say? We spoke to 70 global experts in 20 different countries, and actually found surprisingly little harm that came from disclosure and a huge amount of benefit, including improved competition, improved trust, massive savings and massive efficiency savings for both government and business. So that proactive voice to speak up and kind of identify what good looks like and actively cheerlead for it, and kind of bring other stakeholders together more proactively would be amazing.
Thank you, Gavin. I don't know, Delia, would you like to add to that? Have you got something you want to add about the virtues of going public and going beyond the law?
Yeah, of course. And I would say that I agree completely with Gavin, and also with what Ken and Justin said. We have to move to integrity beyond compliance. Compliance and a rule of abiding is great, but we have to move forward, because when we are talking about integrity, we are talking about principle, trust building values. And in that sense, I think we have also to incorporate not only governments and the private sector, but as Gavin mentioned in his first intervention, we need to involve local communities and citizens in these projects, particularly in the case of infrastructure projects. As we have been saying during the COVID pandemic, for instance, access to contracts on vaccine purchase was absolutely secret, and that's not acceptable. There is absolutely no basis for asking for confidentiality in that. It's public resources used for public benefits. So people have the right to know. And in these infrastructure projects, if I may say, we have to use some tools that are being proven for a long time, since the 90s, like the integrity pacts, that are being considered as part of the Blue Dot initiative, which means that we incorporate a monitor in the contract. And as integrity pacts has been used till now, it goes to the delivering part of the contract. But integrity pacts, with the incorporation of citizens, civil society organizations between the government and the private sector, can be used in the whole cycle of contracts. From the very beginning, from the planning, we need the supposed or targeted beneficiaries to come into contact and to be part of the decision-making process of the design of public policies, because in fact, they are the beneficiaries. And integrity pacts allows these beneficiaries to participate in monitoring that the integrity rules that has been agreed upon are fulfilled, to raise the red flags when something is going wrong, to detect and help to manage conflicts of interest. But this tool is much more than just a procurement tool. It is a way to incorporate participation and inclusiveness in the democratic process, as we have been using it in Europe through our chapters in the near past, and we are doing now in Australia, particularly with infrastructure projects. We need to incorporate beneficiaries, local communities, in the right delivery of these infrastructure projects.
Thank you, Delia. I think you've gone a long way to answer one of the questions that has come up in the Q&A box, which was, are there new procedures to detect corruption in areas of infrastructure investment? And I think that several of you, including you, Delia, now have also spoken about the need for consultative approaches with local stakeholders, the use of integrity pacts right from the beginning, and early explanations and publications about the reasons for infrastructure investments, as Gavin has mentioned. I don't know, Ambassador, whether you'd like to come in on this point about multi-stakeholder approaches and how this is so important in the infrastructure approach, to also perhaps add an angle on this question if you would like to.
No, just to say that, you know, we agree, the United States agrees that the multi-stakeholder approach can really help surface the best practices that all of the other groups bring to bear on these larger infrastructure projects. For example, innovative technologies that the private sector and civil society groups use to identify and investigate corruption can be applied by governments to flag potentially corrupt activity more efficiently. And governments can also provide support to private sector groups to better comply with anti-corruption laws and regulations. The bottom line is everybody should be involved in this, from the local level all the way up to the government level, with the private sector in between. And if that happens, we can go a long way towards creating a better environment for these projects.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's a helpful perspective and adds on to what we've heard from Delia and from Gavin. If I may, I just turn to another question that's in the Q&A, and it goes like this. Maybe, Kenneth, this is something that you might like to tackle. In Mexico, a lot of illegal money goes to political parties and candidates during elections from government public works contracts. I don't think Mexico is alone in that risk.
No.
Unfortunately, what can be done to diminish this kind of corruption? So from your perspective, obviously, we know that you've mentioned cross-divisional ways of coming together and looking at these particular projects in great detail and so on. Obviously, AML tools and due diligence are important, and yet it still happens. So what more can be done? We keep on wanting more, but what more can be done?
Listen, this is an age-old project, right? And it isn't just Mexico. It is everywhere. Again, when you have lots of money, you have a lot of people showing up who want it, and people who have access to it. Generally, you just have to really keep an eye on. How do you stop corrupt public officials from taking bribes from private corporations and other people? It is really hard to do. What you need to do is enforce the law. And that's what a lot of these countries aren't doing. They have no interest in enforcing the law because they themselves are the ones who are benefiting from the corruption. So, I mean, and if you take a look at many of the laws, just use Mexico as an example, because I happen to be very fond of Mexico, and they have laws on the books. Well, enforce them. Many countries do as well. They need to really enforce them. And that enforcement must be transparent. It can't be opaque. It has to be open. There has to be evidence. There has to be an understanding by the public that it isn't a political attack on people. It is based on evidence and how a system works. So I think that's number one. Number two, governments need to be able to resource those who investigate these cases sufficiently and protect those who are actual either whistleblowers or those people in the public who come out and denounce public corruption or corruption. It's pretty scary out there, and you see the courage of so many regular citizens or business people who come out and say, this is wrong. But you know what? Who's going to protect them? Right? There has to be some kind of mechanism for that. And you don't really see it. But just to be really clear, this is something that has been happening since, the Roman times. This is not unusual. And I hate to say it, it's kind of human nature. So, we really have to put in guardrails, rules of transparency when you're talking about political organizations, you're talking about contributions, and you're talking about infrastructure building. If you don't have that, it's going to happen. Everybody knows, and this is like it's not a secret. Everybody knows when there's a huge pot of money that's being given out from the government, who's going to show up to collect it? Everybody knows all the bad guys are going to be there to collect it. And now they have many different ways of doing it. So it's not just on the financing side. It's on the cyber side. It's the cyber enabled crimes. It's, the lack of transparency in some of the payment systems. All of those things need to be looked at if you're going to stop this. But no one country can do it alone. It has to be a concerted effort by those people who have the power to do it. And until that happens, you're going to see it. And let's just face it, you're never going to 100% prevent that from happening. But to the extent that you can catch them, hold them responsible, have them accountable, and make it transparent and public, I think that begins going a long way.
Thank you, Kenneth.
We have
Gemma,
lost.
you cut off.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Cut off.
Yeah,
Now
now
we
yes.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Francisco, for the question, and also to Kenneth for your answer. But I see that Delia raised her hand while Kenneth was talking. Would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, very briefly, I support all Ken has said in terms of the need of enforcement of the rules related to campaign finance. But we have now new challenges in terms of money and politics. We have trans-border financing of campaigns, which present a huge challenge in terms of jurisdiction. We have cyber campaigns, which is another animal in this zoo. We have also to guarantee independence of the judiciary and the public prosecutors. If we don't not only resource the authorities to do the job, as Kenneth has said, we have to guarantee that they are independent. And of course, transparency will help, but we have here the need for collective action. It is nothing that only government agencies can stop, or the private sector or civil society organizations. And we have a trans-border problem here that is asking for new and innovative ways to guarantee at the most possible integrity in elections and integrity in politics.
Thank you, Delia. And I totally agree with you, of course, about collective action for these complex questions. But Ambassador Robinson, would you like to come in on this as well?
Well, I was going to say almost exactly the same thing as Delia. I completely agree. You know, the fact is, if we don't raise the price for corruption, if we don't raise the price for participating in corruption, you know, hurting people's reputations. The reason why FedEx and Citi do so well is that they are very protective of their reputations. And we have to extend that need for protecting your reputation and raise the price when transgressors go beyond what they should be doing in these practices.
Thank you. Thank you for that. There is a question in the Q&A from Marie asking if there are any examples of real-time publicly available beneficial ownership registers when it comes to infrastructure contracts and other public contracts. I don't know, Gavin, whether you, off the top of your head, can answer that one.
I think there's a lot of really good work. So there was another question as well from Mohammed, which is about beneficial ownership registers and good practice. So can I do them both together? Which is there's an awesome organization. I'm on the steering group of it, so I might be biased, but called Open Ownership. It's directly working on building those examples of best practice, you know, how you have a data standard to collect the beneficial ownership information. And then us as the Open Contracting Partnership are thinking how you use that for public contracts and when you collect beneficial ownership information on public contractors and everything else. There are good examples where those registers are now beginning to be interoperable and talking to each other. Nice example would be the great work that Ukraine was doing during its pro-Zorro open contracting reforms, which are still a landmark and will be really helpful for the rapid kind of support and rebuilding of the country, hopefully. And then another nice example is even in quite difficult environments, Nigeria is beginning to publish a register, and they're publishing contracts and starting to look at the two together to think about better kind of automated detection of corruption risks and conflict of interest. And then last example, the UK, having not had a deeply problematic COVID response in terms of who got the public contracts, but the UK is now looking at a fundamental reform of its public procurement system. It has its personal significant control register. They are sharing that information, and then that's going to hopefully plug into the public contracting, open contracting database and standard. And those two will then cross-connect to be able to collect at a kind of single point of all suppliers. So you have a supplier register with the beneficial ownership information for all suppliers through government. You register there once, so it's like a tell us once principle, which should be a huge efficiency saving, but at the same time, it will collect the beneficial ownership information and make it publicly available. So that could be quite a powerful example if done well. So there are ways of doing it. It requires care and good data standards, and then integrating that data into the business model and the flow of decisions that you make across contracting and infrastructure. And that culture of like using the data for better decisions needs capacity and support as well.
Thanks, Gavin. I don't know whether you can pop the website link in the chat or the Q&A answers for open ownership. That would be great. But I think the short answer was look at the UK and then look at the website that Gavin's going to share on that. A question from Barbara focuses on something that was said by several of you on the panel. There's a particular concern about how corruption influences the early decision-making processes about what type of infrastructure is needed, when and why. So it would be useful to hear whether the panelists have seen anything in this regard or have any suggestions on how to mitigate against this. Again, looking for actual examples of really identifying real need and meeting that with a tailored approach to the infrastructure project solution. I don't know if anybody, I'm going to throw this open to the whole panel. Anybody want to put their hand up for this one? Delia, you're on.
Yeah, I think that the Open Government Partnership is a good example through national, some of the national action plans, which has incorporated the beneficiaries or targeted groups within the process of the design of the public policy, particularly related to housing. And this has guaranteed that the project really delivers on the needs of the population, and instead of being planned from a desk far away to the communities where the money will be invested. And Open Government Partnership, the OGP, is now applied in almost 100 countries around the world in many areas of public policies. And the idea is always to enhance transparency and accountability and enhance participation of the citizenship. And I think this is a good example trying to incorporate beneficiaries from the very beginning of the planning of any project or any public policy.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to come in and add anything on this particular question?
I just thought it was a really nice example from, looking at the Mexico City EcoBC, for example, just that great example about fundamentally doing things differently. So it was really interesting because it was both talking to businesses and putting businesses together. So one person may have technology, the other person have the kind of community rootedness or be a local vendor. So how do you bring them together to like reimagine what the bike share scheme could be? So for the first time ever, the city published a kind of request for proposals and worked on receipt of those to like get businesses to talk to each other to build kind of consortia who could better deliver the project. And then really great locally grounded community consultations. There were like 300 kind of responses and feedback about where to put things like bike stations and what could be most helpful for like local economic inclusion. So just that right at the start of the planning process. And that's the perfect time to be engaging people because that gets you to a fundamentally better project that's more locally grounded.
Thank you. Thank you, Gavin. The audience is pushing, and quite rightly so, I think, on the importance of stakeholder engagement and the protection of those stakeholders through the Speak Up processes and protections that requires. And the question is from Seren, how to organize this in a way that makes it meaningful for everyone involved, going beyond mere consultation and towards really multi-stakeholder working, and infrastructure lends itself nicely to this approach because, as we've said, these are long and large complex projects that have different phases and different reasons to interact. And any reflections from the panelists on this would be interesting. I don't know, Justin, we've neglected you for a little while. I don't know whether you'd like to come in on this about how do you, maybe you've got experience from your supply chain experiences? How do you bring in people at different points, and how do you coordinate all that? Maybe that's something we can learn from the logistics sector a little bit.
Yeah, I'll address that question a little bit different way and touch on something that Ambassador Robinson said earlier about reputation and increasing the costs of corruption to the corrupt actors. I think that's a great point on really, the reputational issue, because look, fines mean nothing to some of these big players. They really don't. Reputation can mean a lot more. And as consumers, as business partners, I think we can play a role in corrupt companies or whatever them corrupt governments in just, holding back on doing business with them. We see this in the social justice realm, a lot of areas where companies get in the crosshairs. Russia, I think the world has done a great job of just pulling out. If we're intentional about fighting corruption, then we don't need to do business with companies that are involved in corruption, frankly. And I think, by consumers using their pocketbooks and other companies refusing to do partners, I think that reputational issue can go a long way. Now, look, that's asking a lot, frankly, I think, of some companies. But, what really kind of gets people's attention is when, you can't get business or consumers stop buying your products because of your corrupt activity. So I think that's an important thing to think about how we can do that. Now, on our side, about how we get multiple stakeholders involved in this, I mentioned it earlier. I think it's just being intentional about your interactions with whatever business partners you have. I mentioned earlier, any vendors, any business partners, any state-owned entities that we interact with around the world, we're intentional about our approach on anti-corruption and helping them to the extent they don't have anti-corruption measures that are as advanced or that are as optimal as what we have, helping them set up whatever infrastructure they need to have those processes in place. So to me, it's what are your touch points? Use those touch points. If you can fully utilize those touch points that you have, I think that's going a long way.
Thank you, Justin, for starting that off. I think Delia was going to come in and answer this one live. Are you?
Yeah, I think we have already talked about this and the importance of the integrity packs as a tool that can be used and has been used for almost 3 decades now in very different contexts, from Latin America to Africa, from Europe to Australia. And this integrity packs, which is a flexible tool that have now incorporated technology according to the different complexity of the projects it is applied to, is a way to guarantee the involvement of local communities and citizens. I will share a link for Seren to see if she wants more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Delia. Thank you. Ambassador, I'm going to bring you in on the question from Mila, who I guess is probably in Bosnia. And the question or the statement goes like this at the beginning: if some US companies bribe Bosnian civil servants, the company will be prosecuted in the USA under the FCPA or other legislation. But it is unlikely that the civil servant will be prosecuted here in Bosnia because law enforcement is weak. Because of that, the civil servant will stay at his position and will extort money from another company, and so it goes on. So the question is, what can be done in countries with weak law enforcement where only foreign parties pay the price for illicit activities? I don't know whether you can draw on your experience from Guatemala and from other roles that you've had to help answer this question from Bosnia.
Sure, it's a great question. It's a frustrating question. I have seen it around the world. Part of US foreign policy, of course, is helping to strengthen democratic institutions, whether it be the justice sector or through model legislation, or simply through support for non-governmental organizations. So that's sort of what we do. And I think it's not just the United States that does this. The international community, organizations like the OECD, are all the time helping governments shore up their processes and procedures. Are we doing enough? Probably not. But we keep at it. I would also say though that oftentimes what we will find is that the culture of corruption is such that the only block against it is the international community. And this is when you really need brave citizens of those countries to stand up and speak out and demand more of the people who are governing, whether it's the legislature or the executive. If those two, what I saw in 2015 in Guatemala, and then later when I was in Venezuela, when the international community and ordinary citizens stand up and demand more, governments at a minimum have to listen. If you can get them to act, even better. But they have to listen if those two areas are working together.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that. I don't know, does anybody else want to come in on that particular question about from Bosnia or?
Look, I and I think it's easy to say that, again, these are age-old problems. This is nothing new. This is, history repeats itself. I think that until, we as a world and a society understand that our institutions, if not supported, are going to fall apart. Countries sometimes create these institutions and don't resource them or don't, allow them to function. And that has a detrimental effect on society, on people. And I think, and I get this sense in the last couple of years, 10, 15 years or so, people have forgotten that your institutions need to be supported. If your institutions aren't working, then your society is going to crumble. And that's going to allow people to come in and do the kinds of things that bad people do. And that is, steal money from the government thrift, to do bad things to other people to make more money, to create infrastructure that isn't needed, but it's wealthy, it's good for them because they're making money. All those things exist when your institutions are not supported and are not resourced. And I say that only because I can hear the conversation here, but it's almost like Groundhog Day, right? Because we've all been doing this for so long. There's got to be some kind of way where as a global society, we realize, listen, these are the factors to create a real society. And when your institutions are not supported and people aren't being held accountable and their assets aren't being taken from them, when they steal them, nothing good is going to happen. And I think that those are some fundamental things that people need to really understand.
Thank you. Yeah, I think when we say it's Groundhog Day, and we've seen this, I think the problems of infrastructure have long been known. But what we're seeing now more and more, of course, is the development of technology in the broadest sense. And maybe we can have a couple of minutes just briefly on that. I don't know whether Delia, you'd like to just give us a few perspectives on the challenges that technology creates and what should companies and what should governments be trying to avoid, and whether you've got any promising approaches that you've seen and heard about that you'd like to share with us, because technology is given as a big promise and a big hope, but as we know, there are also risks attached to it. But maybe you can help.
Of course. Thank you for the question. I really think that tech is here to stay, and it can be very helpful, of course. But we have to take into account that these are tools, and tools has been used and can be used in the future for good and evil. I will start for the positive side, and I think that, for instance, technology, and Gavin has been talking about moving from rules to data in this field, and technology can be very useful in terms of sharing information, sharing data, but we need to guarantee the quality of the information. We need to guarantee the interoperability of the different databases, and we have to guarantee that the information is open and usable for citizens. Second, there are tools that can guarantee, particularly in this kind of public procurement, big contracts like infrastructure, technology technologies like blockchain, for instance, which will guarantee that contracts are not modified in a hidden and opaque way, because everybody will have access, and it is impossible just to modify one database because the information is distributed, and this guarantee the security of the information. There are also artificial intelligence tools that can, as Gavin mentioned, put in contact different databases and highlight or raise red flags when dubious or let's say irregular patterns are appearing and can be detected in an automatic way. Also, drone tech, for instance, is used in many countries to, particularly in infrastructure projects, for concomitant accountability, for concomitant monitoring, not waiting for the end of the project or the end of the part of the project to check whether things has been done properly. And this is again tech. What I would really ask not to go is to delegate decision-making on any aspect to artificial intelligence tools, because algorithms can have biased discrimination or even corruption embedded. So if we are going to use algorithmic technologies and artificial intelligence or machine learning, we need to be very careful about the transparency of the tool and the accountability of the tool. We are prepared to hold to account ministers, governments, even private sector, but are we ready to hold to account this kind of machine learning technology? We have to be prepared for that, because that will be the future.
Thank you. I think you covered a lot of the questions on the ground there, the complexities of this topic. I'm conscious of time. Ambassador, I think you had your hand up. Did you want to come in?
I wanted to come in on a previous point. Can't remember what it was. Keep going.
Okay, thanks so much. Sorry for that. Gavin, you have your hand up, I think.
Yeah, just to add to what Steve was saying, it's really not about buying digital things, right? It's actually about buying things digitally. So it's really, if we want this to work well and to improve infrastructure, it's about kind of rethinking the entire flow of decision making and the business logic behind kind of procurement and infrastructure planning, like contracting and delivery, right? For a digital environment that is inclusive, right? You actually think with the stakeholders and their needs, what information you want to get to them, and you design the processes around that, rather than buying an off-the-shelf system and imagine that's going to deliver your outcome. So we shouldn't be taking paper-based, old school, legalistic approaches online. We should be rethinking them around data. And yes, as the Open Partnership, we think of support an open data standard and free global help desk to help people share that information. But what's most important is then how you use that and how you change the culture of decision making and data use within government and outside government to get to better outcomes. And that involves a lot of change management, hand-holding engagement. And of course, you have to merge online and offline approaches to reach communities who most matter. So, but I think that shift from, it's not about buying the tools, exactly as Dina said so well, it's about that whole sort of reimagining the things for digital environments. I guess think about Justin Kenneth for the private sector. I bet the systems they're using like 10 plus years ahead of the sort of public sector sort of system. So that chance to think about things differently and think digitally first seems really smart. It seems like a major opportunity for that transformation that we were laying out as we spoke at the start.
Thank you, Gavin. Justin, do you want to come in very quickly?
Yeah, I'll give a practical side to this, and I think it's right. I think there's two sides of this. One's on the side of the state-owned entities and their processes for transacting and accepting payments, and the other side, in the private sector, on detecting that. On the state-owned entity side, I think the more digital we make payments and interactions between companies and state-owned entities, the less opportunities for corruption. I mean, we've seen some good things on the customs side where customs offices are becoming entirely digital. So when that's the case, We, on the private side of FedEx, we can set rules for no petty cash for customs related employees or no reimbursements for cash payments. It's not going to absolutely prevent someone from making a facilitating payment, but it's going to make it way more difficult the more digital we make these interactions with the government side.
Thank you. That's a great example, and of course, a very important one. And thank you for reminding of that. I'm just going to bring in the last question, and just perhaps it's something that maybe the ambassador would like to speak about, from Joseph, asking about the role of supreme audit institutions or anti-corruption agencies to prevent corruption in public investments. Bringing the government perspective to this question. There are obviously very important government bodies there that are mentioned. Would you like to just say a couple of words about what you see as their role as part of the Biden administration's approach to this?
Oh, absolutely. I think the role of those types of institutions can't be overstated. The problem, of course, is implementation and making sure that they are, someone mentioned it earlier, making sure that they have the strength and the independence to really use the tools available to them to enforce the transparency and, frankly, honesty that's necessary. I will recall once again from my time in Guatemala, the tax authority went after one of the largest scrap metal companies in Guatemala. It was the first time a company like that had ever been forced to open their books. And rather than going to trial, this company paid the debt that was owed to the government in like a day. And it ended up being the half of the government's budget for that year. That was the kind of enforcement action that was available, and through the insistence of non-governmental actors and the international community, giving this audit authority the strength to do what it did. And what we see today, several years later, none of the audit authorities, none of the anti-corruption actors or institutions in Guatemala have that same strength or authority, and the results speak for themselves.
Thank you so much. I think nothing brings things alive more than real experiences and examples, and I think thank you very much for contributing those as well. We're just about out of time. I don't know if Isabel's going to pull the plug on us in a moment, but before she does that, I would like to spend the last moment just saying thank you so much to all of the panel members for your insights and your commitment to making infrastructure more transparent, more accountable, and therefore more relevant and given where it's needed, put in place where it's needed, and not part of a political misuse of public money. You all have incredibly important roles to play, and we all have to play our part. I think collective action and multi-stakeholder approaches that go from end to end, supported by digital technology, clearly is important. The political will that we've seen through the leadership of some countries, and as Ambassador Robinson has explained from the US perspective, is also very important and necessary because we're in very difficult and challenging times. So thank you all for your expertise and your time, and keep up the good work. And I look forward to interacting with many of you over the next few days and in the months to come. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand it back to Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna.
You're on mute, Isabel.
Thank you all for coming, and have a great day, and keep up the good fight.
Thank you. Nice seeing everyone.
Thank you for having us.